have thoughts about it. Okay, over to you again, Bas.
Yeah, so it's now recording, everyone, just so you know. You should also see it in the screen, but just a heads up. I prepared a few questions, so I'm very excited to hear your thoughts about that. But I wanted to start quite broadly and to explore the sort of the why or the purpose that you got into this whole regenerative field, and to ask, so what does the work that you do towards creating regenerative futures, what does it mean for you and why do you do it?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me personally, it's been a long journey from studying biology because I wanted to understand life and how life works, to then falling in love with the idea of wanting to be a marine biologist and study whales and dolphins, like many young biologists want to do. And having a chance to do that, like I gained a scholarship to do some research in California on elephant seals and on dolphins, and sitting on like doing that research for 6 months, and then realizing by talking to professors that had been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years of their life, that the most likely trajectory that I would take as a marine biologist studying dolphins would be to spend my life with a particular school of dolphins in a particular area, following them and learning about them, and eventually seeing how they would take the path towards extinction. And I kind of realized that to serve the dolphins most, I would have to deal with my own species rather than keep working on marine biology. And that's quite a long time ago. But it sort of disheartened me, took me away from the path of science. Also, I at the time realized how limited science had become. Like I was fascinated with science and like really the kind of Humboldt-like sense, Humboldt's book, The Cosmos, of really understanding how it all hangs together and how it's all one web that transforms and evolves. And at the time, science had an extremely reductionist way of seeing things. It's beginning to be better, but I mean, this is only 20 years ago. And so I kind of turned my back on science, and then had this obsession of wanting to live the solution rather than be part of the problem. So quite early on in 1999, I tried to set up an environmental education center, an eco-village in southern Spain, and still a little bit with a sort of hippie-ish dream, like I had long hair and a VW van, and tried to get all my friends together to live in an eco-village. And I learned a shed lot by trying to do it and by failing. And because I noticed how the social dimension and the team building and how to actually come to a shared vision and a shared mission and a process of decision making that everybody feels included, but you can still move forward rather than constantly argue. All of that, I had no idea that was part of setting up an environmental education center when I started. Like I thought it was all about compost toilets and solar panels and those kind of things. And then also realizing how important the economic dimension was. And that's when I went to Schumacher College, and Schumacher College really opened my perspective in a way that I'm still deeply grateful. Like I would say the 18 months that I spent there doing a master's in holistic science were the most transformative years of my time of my life. Also because of the people I met there, and even today I feel it's a community that has evolved together over the last 20 years. And yeah, so maybe I should also say that the work that I've done with Joanna Macy around the work that reconnects and deep ecology, like really in an embodied way, feeling my unity with life and my right to speak as life, like this sort of slight shift in perspective away from being so centered on that who I am is this guy captured in this skin boundary that you kind of seeing on the screen. but that I'm actually a web of relationships, and that you can almost flip that the other way around, and that I'm just I'm an expression of life as a planetary process. And for me, that's what's driving me to keep doing this work, because I feel that future, I mean, life is going to continue, but the abundant, diverse future that we've inherited 3.8 billion years of life's evolution on planet Earth, and life has created conditions conducive to life, made the planet more abundant, richer, more diverse for most of that time. And our behavior has, over the last 250 years, or even the last 5,000 years, increasingly degenerated that abundance and decreased it. And I feel a responsibility that while I have the chance in this lifetime to speak up for life. So that's really what drives me.
It's very, very interesting, and I think at the core of what you just shared, as well as the writing that you do, there's this relational ontology or relational perspective on everything, really, that everything is a relation of, or part of the larger web of life. Do you think that being able to see the relational perspective, or to think in relations, is a key aspect of helping regions become more regenerative?
I think it's even more dynamic than that. Like there's the relational part, that everything is interconnected with everything else. Like Professor Midgley from the University of Hull for system science, Jared Midgley, he says everything is an intervention. And that's a powerful sentence when you sit with it for a while, because everything we do affects that interconnected whole. You can't but not affect it, because you're part of it, and it's all in relation. But what's also important is to realize that that includes the cognitive, non-physical dimension. So it's not just the thing, the object that we are in space, but it's what we think and what we say, what we put into the noosphere, what we put into our shared mental space, that affects how we see the world, and also what potential of the future we actually unleash with what we say, what we think, and what we do. And yeah, so in that sense, if you have that dynamic understanding of how everything interrelates, then you can begin to ask, if everything I do changes everything around me, even sometimes slightly, sometimes transformatively, then how do I participate appropriately in that complexity in a way that serves on three levels? And this is indigenous wisdom that all indigenous wisdom cultures have always asked with most decisions, is, does it serve myself? Does it serve my community? And does it serve life? Does it serve the whole? And we've lately become a culture that only asks the first question. And the problem with that is that the supportive circle stops if you don't support planetary health and community health. Ultimately, we're learning that it will affect our own health, and that's what's happening all over the globe. So yeah, I think it's vital to have this, both the participatory perspective and the relational perspective, that really we bring forth a world in relationships and through how we think about it.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I need a second, because it's a really nice segue to my next question, and particularly your point about how we can connect to that complexity and the web of complexity in a participatory way. But I was wondering, how do you think that education, or higher education as an institution, can connect to that complexity around the institutions in a more regenerative manner?
Well, because there is this almost circular, well, it is a circular relationship between worldview and design. Design in the widest sense is how we interact with the world and what we bring into being through our intentions. And so Winston Churchill once said, first we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. That's true pretty much for every design. Like this technology shapes how and who we are, because we've created this technology and now we use it, and it will shape us subtly what we hold possible. I mean, if you all think about how much time we now spend on computers compared to people 20 years ago, and that means that there's this, on the one hand, we bring forth a world based on our worldview. On the other hand, the world then influences our worldview, and we're seeing that in a, to my mind, deteriorative way with the slightly obsessed technology people in Silicon Valley and at Google X and at the Singularity University, where we're almost transferring what used to be religion, all the kind of live forever and download onto a microchip, all these transcendent impulses that used to be carried on by religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs are now transferred into a belief in science, and almost making science and technology a unconscious type of religion. And it's the role of education to be mindful of those relationships, and to not try to, like, at the root of education is the word educare, which means to draw out rather than to stuff in. But I find even that to draw out is that sort of assumes there's already everything in there. I prefer the image that Paulo Freire, Pedagogy for the Oppressed, a wonderful book on education. He said education is much more, it is far less a filling of a vessel than it is about the lighting of a flame. And in that image of the flame comes together what nourishes the flame from the inside. Each and every one of you has that in them, but it's also the oxygen from the environment that enables education. So for me, the role of education is to really ignite people to live their essence, to start from who am I, what am I here to do, to really look deeply into what the Sufis say is written on the back of your heart, the job you came here to do. And then to try to manifest that in the world. And a good educator tries to help people find that in themselves, and then sets the enabling conditions for that flame to burn as brightly as possible. Yeah, for me, that's vital. And I currently see that higher education, I mean, your course looks wonderful. If I look at all the people that you've pulled together to put input in all the topic areas you're integrating, to my mind, you're really onto something with this course. And it's unfortunately, to my mind, the exception. Most universities are still preparing people to know more and more about less and less, go down the tunnel of a disciplinary silo that then creates experts that can't think systemically anymore. And that's one of the problems that we have, that we then have high-level scientific achievement experts that don't have the systemic thinking to understand how what they're proposing is not understanding the systemic implications.
So that's a really, I mean, first of all, well, thank you, of course, for the compliments. Really nice. But I very much agree, because if I sort of translate what you said, that nurturing of the flame, or that kindling of the flame, from my mind translates to the environments and the conditions as a design question in a way. So to design educational processes and structures in such a way that the kindling of that fire, of that essence, is supported, instead of, you know, reaching specific intended learning outcomes, of going further down those disciplinary silos. So I very much agree with that. I could probably talk to you for hours, but I also want to give the students a good opportunity to ask some questions.
Yeah, let me just one thing to sort of highlight, that for me, central to education is actually less the content of the solutions and answers you offer, but is more about asking the right questions. And of course, the art is to ask the right loaded questions to guide thinking in a certain direction, and bring in certain aspects that will enable people to form their own view of what you asked the question about, but to leave it open, because the minute you ask questions, you really want people to engage and contribute. But by teaching principles and solutions and answers, you're sort of saying, I already know, and join me. And that's why in my book, there are 250 questions. And I don't know if you're aware of this thing that I did for Guy Education with regard to sustainability education, these flashcards. They're basically helping people to engage with the SDGs at a community level by each card, like for each of the 17 SDGs, there are 3 cards, and on each card, you're coming from 4 dimensions to already draw people out of the silo. So you ask questions from the ecological, the social, and the economic, which are the classical 3-legged stool of sustainability, but also the worldview dimension. So you bring in the awareness how important our values, our worldviews, our narratives, our storytelling actually is in how we answer these questions. And so in the white boxes, there's a little bit of information about trends on one particular SDG in that context, and then in the colorful, there are questions. And this tool is now available in 7 or 8 languages: Arabic and Chinese and Russian, and supported by UNESCO. They translated it since we brought it out in 2017, I think. But it's an example of how I see education. Like when I was asked to design a course on the SDGs, I still had a bit of a critical perspective on the way the SDG conversation was going, and even the SDGs. And so I was trying to, on the one hand, fulfill my brief, but also bring in a sort of positively subversive way of opening up all the conversations around where I feel the SDGs are lacking, particularly SDG number 8, continued economic growth, kind of puts the elephant in the china shop. Like that's what like it derails everything else, basically. So what I've done with this, there are another 200 questions around the SDGs, is create what, like for me, this is a Buckminster Fuller once said, if you want to change the way people think, don't tell them what to think, give them a tool, the use of which will change the way they think. And of course, that applies to our iPhones and our computers and all that kind of stuff as well, because it is changing how we think. But this kind of, like, I see my book and the set of cards as that kind of tool, because just through the question, I'm trying to cognitively prime people to think more systemically and more regeneratively. But yeah, I'll leave it to that, because I also am keen on questions from everybody. Sorry if I'm babbling so much.
No, that's fine. And I can see that Carl has his hand up, so I'll give you the chance to ask your question in a second. I just want to quickly respond. I think what you're saying is really interesting. And it's also particularly why I see such a big role for students in these types of transitions in a way. Because I think that students are quite uniquely situated in society to be the sort of the asker of these types of questions for quote unquote professionals who are a little bit more stuck in existing systems. That being said, Carl, please go ahead and ask your question, and then anyone after that who would like to just go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. By the way, first book I've read in like 6 years is yours, so congratulations. You were talking about technology, and of course there's a topic that's always been lingering in my head. And in your book, you always say sometimes we should kind of go back to our roots, learn from what we used to do, and try to reduce our footprint in that kind of way. And but on the other side, you said technology is becoming a new religion and kind of taking over our life, since like I can't live without my laptop without talking to you right now. Telephones are a thing. Do you see that like literally taking over us eventually? Like what's your mind and what's your view upon it?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I can share with you a paper that I wrote in 2006, which was called A Cyborg's Choice, in which, like, even back then, I was doing research for my PhD, and I kind of ventured. One of the beautiful things about what Bas was saying about the role of students, like, please take the opportunity to enjoy reading books, because when you're in education, you have the wonderful privilege to actually read as much as you want, which I unfortunately can't do at the moment. And back then, I took a detour in my research suddenly into all the Singularity University figureheads, like Ray Kurzweil's book on the singularity and so on. And I wrote this paper because I already then saw in this budding what's called transhumanism, this belief system that eventually technology will help us to transcend biological realities of life. For me, that is completely deluded. It's an engineers and software engineers narrowed understanding of the complexity that we're participating in. We are living beings. Anybody who says that nature and culture are actually separate and that humans are somehow out of nature only has to try to hold their breath for longer than 8 minutes, and then give me an answer of whether they were right or not, and then we can see. Like, ultimately, we're deeply dependent on the health of the biosphere, and I think we are at this point where we need to have an ethical, conscious conversation about what is the appropriate use of technology, and technology has been. What kind of helps is to understand that the printing press was a technology too, and that books are technologies too. And in a paradox way, I'm on the one hand arguing that we shouldn't believe that we can merge into this technology in a way that I don't think consciousness is downloadable onto a microchip. I think that's also misunderstanding how consciousness works. But at the same time, we also need to stop seeing technology as other from nature, because if the biophysical unity that is the biosphere within a planetary system, within a cosmos, is all fundamentally interconnected, then everything within it is to some degree part of nature. And so even our nuclear power stations and our atom bombs and everything technological we've created is part of that biophysical reality. The atoms and molecules in it are part of the cycles. That's why we're messing up with it. And so really, to ask what technologies to use, and now that we're bumping up very hard against planetary boundaries and resource constraints that will hit really hard over the next 10, 15 years, we are getting to a point where we also have to ask, because we have to make a choice, because we can't put energy into developing all technologies in abundance with a kind of programmed obsolescence type mindset of just the quicker turnover, the better iPhone 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Yeah? And so for me, it's this paradox situation that on the one hand, technology will be part of the solution. And if we don't have a much more ethical and wiser decision on how to use technology, it might also be the most likely cause of our early demise. So I'm not anti-technology, but I do think that we need to very much choose very wisely. Like, for example, all this research that DARPA is doing on target recognition softwares in autonomous robots, like the little dog, the Boston Dynamics dog, being able to see who is enemy and who is supposedly not enemy on a battlefield. And they're doing research on these robots being able to eat flesh in order to draw energy from it to have autonomy on the battlefield. I mean, this is the kind of madness that cyborg movies and sci-fi horror dystopias are made from. And we're
literally how the Terminator starts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's the bizarre thing. That's part of this technology and religion blending Hollywood into, like, sci-fi is creating realities. It's part of the proof that we have to watch out how we think, what stories we tell, because they become to some extent real. And that's precisely where we need to be super careful. We're all addicted to technology, and we're all already cyborgs. Whether it's in us or in our hand is only a difference of nuance.
Yeah, we're reliant on technology.
Yeah,
but I like what you said about we're living in a sci-fi, because the other book we're reading had one chapter about how sci-fi people used to be imaginations of someone's mind, but eventually we're living up to them because it's a possible scenario. Sci-fi isn't sci-fi anymore. It's a possible future.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, what was stark, I don't know if you saw this in social media, somebody had taken a screen grab out of the Blade Runner, the second Blade Runner movie, and then pictures from San Francisco when it was in that red cloud of after the fires. And you couldn't tell the difference. It literally looked like a scene out of Blade Runner 2, what just happened in San Francisco. Okay.
I'm going to look it up right now. That's, yeah, those were my questions. Thank you very much, by the way.
There's Jan Pico.
Yes, so on a continuative way with what you were saying right now, do we have a kind of an ethical or moral obligation to do positive scenario creating and positive science fiction?
I think that's one of the most powerful ways of meme seeding and doing kind of mimetic acupuncture in culture creation, is to basically create positive visions of the future that people can identify with, that ideally even offer a subtle critique on alternative pathways, and inspire people to basically put their energy into bringing about that future. Because it's a shame that obviously capable and intelligent people that are good manifestors, because you don't build $1 billion enterprise, you don't build a unicorn if you don't know how to bring ideas and vision into reality. But Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, they're all investing in outer space type technologies because they've been bombarded all their lives with, that's the final frontier, to boldly go where no man has gone before, Star Trek. But the reality is, we're an immature species who hasn't learned the basic rules of how to live regeneratively within the biosphere. If we end up going to other planets, even if we achieve it, we become the locusts of the known universe, and we won't have a future. I love this Calvin and Hobbes comic, where Calvin says to Hobbes, they stand in front of a bunch of tree trunks cut off and litter on the ground. And Calvin says to Hobbes, I think the most convincing proof for the existence of higher intelligences in outer space is that they haven't contacted us. We're not there yet. We need to mature and be much wiser species. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question in terms of, going back to kind of education and changing a collective place of perception of where we perceive from. How do you think is the difference? I mean, what you said before is that, what we talked about before is that we have a special position as students in the sense that we're not, haven't been so indoctrinized by this older degenerative system. But then in sort of like the present moment and the future, how do you think education, or the kind of forms of it, is needed for higher level education and sort of even younger levels of education? Like, what do you think is the difference, or the most challenging parts of that difference in that sense?
I think that our education system is trying to transform, but has so many deeply ingrained patterns in the way it tests, and it moves people through a sort of system of grades and so on, that one of the most important things is to get out of this mindset of, like, there's a sort of a misunderstood Darwinism in the way we design education programs, like who gets the better grade, and like survival of the fittest, competition built into the very structure of it. And I mean, education is trying to undo this. I mean, Bas was just saying that you're working on these projects not as individuals but as teams, and you probably get assessed also as teams, and that's already showing how education is trying to build the capacity to collaborate. It's so important to, like, again, there's always this, rather than going into an either or, it's a both and. Like, I don't want to say specialization isn't super important. Like, I would love somebody to be extremely specialized if I ever need open heart surgery, because if it isn't, I probably won't survive. But at the same time, we need to value how things are interconnected. And in early childhood education, to some extent, this COVID situation is, in some areas, is bringing people to do more work outside again. And I think young kids should actually see nature as the biggest teacher and be taught maths and biology and chemistry and physics and geometry and all those things by being out in nature, because it would create a different patterning of where you look for answers. If you think that you have to look for answers on a tablet and in a book, rather than by observing and participating in natural processes like school gardens and so on. But ultimately, again, it's less about the content, the learning of what we do now, because knowledge is expanding so rapidly. It's the pattern recognition mind and the interconnection mind and the sort of almost the ability to scan many different fields and interconnect them that is now so needed. We've already got a wealth of specialized knowledge, but we haven't actually done, like, now we use AI to mine big data, but we need to use our own much more creative minds to mine all the wonderful knowledge that humanity has collected, but connect it again, synthesize, find new ways of applying it. Yeah, that for me, that's central to education. That understanding also that working regeneratively is about the capacity to respond to the transformation of the nested wholeness that we're in, including our own transformation, including questioning of what am I called to do now? There's a deeply evolutionary principle in this. It's all about capacity building to evolve, like the people from the Regenerative group, who I learn a lot from, call it co-evolving mutuality, which I would call appropriate participation in complexity. Is the same thing. This capacity is at the heart of it. Okay.
Yeah, I really like what you said about creating different patterning of how children get to answers and away from tablets, but creating what you said, the environment conducive for them to get their own answers within the system. And in that sense, that ecology of whether it's, if they want to learn about, a small example of how biology and chemistry works, that you give them not necessarily the actual functions and formulas, but rather give them a garden to really understand how it all interconnects within that system.
Yeah, I personally still remember after always sort of doing maths and kind of going, what's this for? And why do I have to jump through these hoops? And I would learn it and get a good grade, but not really understand what the point of it was. And then in 11th grade, when I was already 17 or something, one math teacher explaining calculus to us brought in a picture of a tree and showed some growth patterns in trees and said, by the way, this is how you can calculate how trees grow. And suddenly it had just much more relevance and meaning to me. But I think Mari was going to ask a question.
First, I'm really thankful that you're here today with us because I also had a question for you, and it was related to what you previously said about seeing COVID as a way to get the children outside again so that they could learn from nature. And this is also part of your book, the biomimicry topic. And I was really wondering about your opinion on biomimicry, and also the fact that so many species are are just disappearing because we try to take over their life, and this would also affect biomimicry. And I was wondering what is your opinion about this?
But biodiversity loss is just as big a problem as climate change. I mean, they're both related, deeply related. I mean, climate change drives biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss makes the impact of climate change worse. And yet, the problem, to my mind, is further upstream. It's in the stories we tell about who we are and how we relate to life and how we see life. The fundamental shift that we made at some point from, if you look at one common factor among pretty much all indigenous cosmologies and worldviews, they all understand themselves as belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to them. There's a shift in ownership. There's also, in many of them, they don't understand time the way we understand time, because when you don't feel ownership, even this extreme identity with self and the individual, like we've been trained to believe of ourselves, but you see yourselves more as an expression of life, then it's even like you don't feel like you own your own life. You're part of a process, and that then shifts your relationship to time, because you're deeply connected to that long period of life continuing, and your personal lifetime is something else. And it's only when we, to my mind, if we recognize that our senses, David Abram, who wrote this beautiful book, Spell of the Sensuous, he said something along the lines of, we're only truly human in conviviality with everything non-human. Our ears have been shaped by the hoot of the owl. Our eyes have been sharpened by the running of the gazelle or whatever. I can't exactly quote him, but it's just beautiful how he brings in how our very biological being in so much of our species history has been shaped by our relationships to the forest and the savannas that we moved through. And every time one species dies, we lose a manifestation, a perspective, and a library of experience, of connections, and we impoverish the web that creates health in this life as a planetary system perspective. So for me, that healing and regenerating the patterns that enable life, like the Janine Benyus, to my mind, has nailed it with this one beautiful sentence where her sort of summing up lesson of having studied lots of different species and patterns in nature and what can we learn from life, and having created this wonderful list of life's principles, how to design in accordance with the patterns that we observe in nature. When she boils it all down to one sentence, she says, life creates conditions conducive to life. And that's a powerful sentence. And once we re-identify with life, then our role becomes creating conditions conducive to life. So for me, the goal of education is capacity building so we can create conditions conducive to life. And that means to our community, our more than human community, ecosystem in which we participate, understanding that this is not a sort of moving from the ego to the eco, like at the moment where is so fashionable of naming it. It's a reintegration of the ego or the self into the eco by being in service to life, by understanding that the only way that I can actually serve myself in a enlightened self-interest is to manifest my capacity, my unique contribution to this world that I'm capable of giving, in the context of serving my community and my local ecosystem and life as a planetary process. And that's, for me, like there's a little bit of gimmicky consultancy type biomimicry work out there where people just sort of copy the shape of an animal or a plant and create another technological innovation. And it's nice. It's taking people into a deeper connection with understanding how life works. But for me, really the power of working with learning from nature and learning to design as nature is this putting ourselves back into that web and looking at the systemic patterns, the patterns that are underlying how in ecosystem life creates conditions conducive to life, and then transforming them into how we create our communities, how we create our enterprises, how we create our systems of governance, how we structure, how we meet our needs. Life doesn't ship everything all over the globe. Life produces in the region, for the region, with local resources, with current solar income or renewable energy in a way that doesn't create toxic residues. I mean, that's a pretty good marching order for how we should redesign our systems of production and create circular economies at much more local patterns using biomaterials, and how we should repattern our cities. And we need to also understand that our cities are created by life, by us. And if you look how a city, a natural city evolves, not a mega plant city, it has the same patterns that is almost like a cellular organism. And we need to reinvigorate those cities in order to bring them back to life. Anyway, went into all sorts of directions there. There's Aman.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that I'm really inspired by your book. It really changed a bit like the way I think about the world. So yeah, thank you for that. I had a question actually, because you talk about humans thinking about technology almost religiously. And you also say that we should go back to our roots, which I think is also kind of religious. And then you also talk about ethics. So my question is, are you a religious person? And what's your standard of truth? And where do you base your values on?
Okay. You asked the easy questions. Religio, to bind together. At the core of what religion's intention was, is to create a narrative that would make us understand our unity with that complex dynamic system that brings us forth. So you can, I think we're now at a point where we can use the insight of science. We can use what we know about the evolution of the universe, life on Earth, how life works, and reanimate a deeper story of interconnection, of interbeing, of not being separate, of competition being present in life's processes, but as ripples on the surface, as the waves on the surface of an ocean of symbiosis and working together and creating conditions conducive to life. So really, I always say, when you stand in front of the ocean, the waves pull your attention because they're big, they're crashing, they're noisy. But we need to pay attention that underneath that, the whole sea, all of that water is life's interconnections, creating better conditions for more life. And then there's a bit of fine tuning at the top. And we need an ethic that is, like, for example, Aldo Leopold in Sand County Almanac proposed a land ethic, where he said, again, I'm quoting from memory, a thing is right if it preserves and supports the vitality and integrity of the biotic community. It is wrong if it does otherwise. That's a pretty simple statement, but once you understand that your health depends on the health of the ecosystem you're in and the health of the planet, then to ask that question with everything we do, does this serve life and the health of life, I think is a pretty good moral guiding post. And I'm also very conscious to ask the question, am I a religious person? I find that most religions, when they institutionalize, have created more strife than benefits. So I mean, I don't need to name the examples, we know them. But at the same time, in every religion, like I was raised somewhat Christian, Protestant, spent some time in a Catholic monastery, which really put me off institutionalized religion as a student, not as a monk. But I've studied Hinduism, I've studied Sufism. Like there's a mystical tradition in each of the world's religions that basically speaks about the same thing. Aldous Huxley called it the perennial philosophy. There's something about that deeper connection to the whole that brought us forth, and the deeper sense of meaning, or that I think is valuable and is needed as a compass. But I would hope that we find the deeper meaning of religion again, of binding together humanity and binding together the community of life, because I think that's part of that evolutionary jump that we're in now. We need to understand that that if we don't serve all of life and the community of life, then we won't be here for very long.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Who else? Carl would like another one. Let's just see if somebody else who hasn't asked a question. Okay, Carl, you go.
All right. I liked, it was one of the very first chapters that we talked about. It was like cut culture and nurture nature. It's kind of like, that again, going back to your roots, because everyone is stuck in their own bubble, that they're not really thinking about nature anymore. So that's why I like you talking about in cutting culture and applying more nature. That's one of the things I saw happening in Australia. Was the Aboriginals cultures are being demolished. The only county in that country is, I think, Victoria, with Melbourne, that still care about Aboriginals culture. But for the rest, no one really cares about it. And maybe if you read about it, I wanted to know your opinion of how to interconnect both of their cultures to maybe have a not really utopia, but a better future together. Because pretty now it looks pretty bleak for the Aboriginals.
Yeah, it's interesting because it always depends on who you know and what information you look at. Like I guess maybe I'm in a bubble, but I've in the last year and a half had an opportunity to speak to a lot of people in Australia and also in New Zealand, both Aboriginal Maori people, but also people who have kind of colonial background of having come there at some point, or their ancestors having come there. And I just noticed that in the world, the circles I move in, there's a deep recognition of the importance of that 40,000 years of knowledge of how to live wisely in place that the Aboriginal culture, probably 100,000 years even, has carried forward in their oral traditions and their songs and their songlines. And I think it's lovely that whenever I give a Zoom call or like a webinar with people in Australia, there's always a honoring of the land that they're speaking from and an honoring of the people who are the original owners or inhabitants of that land, because they don't see themselves as owners. And I also, there's a wonderful book called Sand Talk by Tyson Yunker Porter, who's a Aborigine professor in Australia. And I think the subtitle is How Indigenous Worldview or Indigenous Wisdom Can Save the World. And he speaks about their deep relationship as custodians to life as a process. And for me, like I wanted to highlight that I'm not saying less culture, more nature. I'm saying nature and culture are the same, and we need to create a culture that expresses its deep relationship to the more than human community.
No, I'm not saying like cut nature entirely, but like cut culture, because culture is at an extreme at the moment. Like you said in your book, we're only thinking about ourselves and not thinking about what's around us. So that's what I meant. Like dial it down a bit and dial nature up a bit. That's what I was trying to say.
But there is something really important in my book that sometimes gets overlooked, is that the title is plural. There is no one regenerative culture. And I also think that when we say culture is like this right now, yeah, there's a dominant culture, and I would say you're right, which is deeply disconnected from our reciprocal relationship to the wider community of life. But at the same time, there are lots of cultures that aren't our dominant Western culture, but indigenous cultures all over the world who are not connected, and who actually, while they've been deeply hurt and traumatized by some of the colonial things that have happened, there's still in pockets indigenous wisdom that has been carried through, that we now, again, in this attempt to move into synthesis, we don't need to go back to a golden past and all become like the original indigenous people again, but there is a kind of re-indigenization that we need to do as everybody on the planet, to come back to place, to come back to that community of life, to come back to our original roles of being guardians of those patterns. And in that return journey of which is a forward moving, not a backward, we do need to recuperate the wisdom that when we moved into the technological and the scientific area, we started calling cultures primitive, that had 10,000 years of knowledge to share with us. And I think we're just getting to the point of overcoming our colonialized conditioning, to begin to realize that that was a massive mistake, and to begin to realize that even the agricultural practices and so many of the practices that they have can inform a new way forward, but in combination with modern technology and science and what we've learned since.
Okay.
Nicholas also had a question again.
Yeah, I really like the this of course taking lessons from current indigenous cultures, and a theme that you often bring up is that is there connection to the land, with what you said before as well, that they belong to the land, and that there is an active dialogue between these cultures and the environment around them, and that they practice a form of listening that is much deeper to the environment than what we currently or mostly have. I want to ask, what do you think it means to then kind of connect to the environment around us when we are living in an urban environment? Is that something, like, you think that it? Yeah, how does it mean? Sorry.
No, I get you. Thank you. This is great, because it also speaks to the heart of working regeneratively. Like, one of the things we can learn from indigenous wisdom cultures is the minute you understand yourself as a pattern that emerges out of the land, and so you belong to the land rather than the land belongs to you, then all the way we make decisions or find solutions or formed by that land. And most, like, one of the central ways of working regeneratively is to try to place source solutions, to really be careful not to cookie cutter, copy paste solutions that you found somewhere else. It's like, oh yeah, Amsterdam is doing this, let's do this in Den Haag. But to really say, okay, what is the culture and the bio, I call it the biocultural uniqueness of place. What is the ecosystem here? What is the situation? Even if, like, when you see a city as part of the ecosystem, you can also see, well, there isn't a lot of other life than human life, but it's still an ecosystem. And to really try to get informed by everything that you know about that place, the hydrology, the geology, the flora, fauna that is there now, that was there before humans built something on top of it, the historical patterns of that land, even through the ages, the connection to the world of being a harbor and agricultural patterns and commerce patterns, all of that informs a place. And so when I heard Bas say one of your challenges there in this area of Den Haag, I was thinking like one of the differences that what indigenous people would do, they wouldn't necessarily kind of in their teams go to that place and look at the wasteland, post-industrial wastelands there, or whatever the situation is, and say, so what can we do here? The first thing they would do is to sit there and ask the place, what does the place want to be done there? And because their worldview allows the possibility that the place can actually answer in them and through them, because they're part of the place, they get a very much deeper connection. And of course, there are methodologies. I mean, Goethean science and Goethean methodology takes you into this reading place and landscape in a different way. Christopher Alexander's work with pattern language also tried to do that kind of reading of landscapes. Permaculture always says before you do anything in a place, you need to observe it through all its seasons in order to understand the life's dynamics in that place. But it is, it's also like the Regenerative group, when they work on development, like redevelopment of areas, which they very much do, they interview a lot of people, and they interview them about this notion of essence. What is unique to this place? They ask many people in different walks of life, from the developer to the local bird watching group that opposes the developer. What is your connection to this place, and what is unique to it, and how do you see its history? What is it trying to express? What are we trying to unveil, rather than what are we trying to do here? And then they mirror that back to the community in a way that people begin to create a shared field around that vision of the potential of the place, like not starting with all the problems. This area is polluted and this area is a big motorway running through it, but to see the potential that lies under those problems. I would love to hear some of the quiet people that I only see names of: Lucia, Yari, Lorenzo, Thea, Minke, Paul, Ladi. If you have a question. Also, I haven't really, because I'm talking, I haven't really looked at the chat. There's a lot going on in the chat. I might not be able to read it all. Here's some. Tina.
Hi, I was just wondering, sorry, it's super loud around here. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about your background and why you wrote this book. Like, how did you came about to do it? Because I think it's quite interesting to see it like in a holistic way, right? What inspired you to do that? Like, why did you find it necessary? And also because I'm German as well, and I sometimes feel like me being German keeps my thoughts a little bit in a box, and I have like an issue like taking it to a little bit of broader perspective. And yeah, so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Well, about the German bit, I find that Humboldt and Goethe and Schiller, which are at the core of German culture, before we went down the kind of square-headed, rule-bound path, have a lot to offer to this, because this participatory, dynamic worldview that understands life not just as physical objects that need to be explained in a kind of Newtonian billiard ball universe, but that understand life in a dynamic, holistic, ecological way. Ernst Haeckel, the founder of ecology, was German. So much of that dynamic participatory worldview is actually expressed throughout German culture. Rudolf Steiner and the whole anthroposophical movement have a lot of wisdom. So there is a way of connecting with German roots and drawing some really useful stuff out there. But how did I get into this? Well, I started the story earlier when I was talking to Bas, that what brought me to Schumacher College, this interest in how science could explain how everything holds together rather than explain everything apart. And at Schumacher College, I met a guy called Henry Botoft, who had studied with David Bohm, the physicist who wrote a lot about wholeness as well. And Henry gave me this idea of like what another old discipline that also informed Goethe is alchemy and the marriage of the opposites, or the potential that happens when you don't see things as either or, but as dynamic polarities that actually create potential. And Henry gave me this, when I said, even back then in 2001, I wanted to write a book. He said, why do you want to write a book? There are too many books on this planet already. If you want to write a book, then make it a work that works, which is something that actually has this alchemical notion of a touchstone that in the ideal case, somebody who's read it and deeply set with the questions will not be the same person than they were when they first picked up the book. And that was always my high aim of trying to write a work that works. And that started in 2001 when I was writing my master's thesis, and then I overshot my master's thesis and wrote 400 pages. And then Stefan Harding, who was the guy who had to mark it, partially because he didn't want to read it all, told me, well, that's a bit too much, that's a PhD, and if you hand it in like that, then I have to read it all, and you won't be able to hand it in as a PhD. So why don't you cut out most of it, keep it aside, and then you're already halfway there to a PhD. And so that's what I did. I cut it down to 140 pages. And then I wrote my PhD and did the same thing again. And my PhD ended up being 750 pages, 300,000 words. Only possible because I was in a design school where PhDs were still quite new. And therefore, they hadn't established all the rules that are normally common, that a PhD should be around 100,000 words. And then that book came, or that the PhD came out, and my PhD supervisor, not a supervisor, my external examiner was a wonderful man called Professor David Orr. He's written beautiful books that I highly recommend. He coined the term ecoliteracy. And David Orr kindly wrote an email to the current science editor of MIT Press, saying, don't make the mistake of not publishing this PhD as a book through MIT Press. And then the whole reviewing process started, and nobody wanted to review 750 pages. And David Orr helped again, and Bob Costanza and Sim van der Rim and David Ehrenfeld, three really powerful academics, kindly reviewed my PhD. But back then in 2006, the answer in the end from MIT Press was, we'd love to have a book from you, but we don't want to publish 750 pages. Can you rewrite this and make it 200, 250 pages maximum? And at the time, I just was done with more writing, and I disappeared into trying to applying this theory. And I spent 10 years because in science, I couldn't find funding for the kind of research I wanted to do, which was too applied. I ended up sidestepping and running Findhorn College and living in an eco-village in the far north of Scotland, where I then was able to work with academics from all over the world, bringing them to the eco-village to experience sustainability in a systemic way. And it was really after spending 10 years of testing the ideas that I developed in this PhD and morphing them and transforming them, that I sat down again and said, well, I guess now it's the time to write this book. And I remember very early on sitting down and reconnecting to this, wanting to write a work that works, and really critically asking myself, what is it that makes this book worth writing? Like, why this book? And that's when I realized that I had lots of ideas on how to create sustainable systems. I studied biology and studied biomimicry and studied product design, architecture, and all the different scales of design, from industrial ecology, circular economy, all that. And of course, there were lots of solutions that I had in my mind that I might want to integrate and talk about in this book. But it really only came together when I began to realize that we might be over-focused on solutions and not pay enough attention to questions. That I felt like I had that way of writing something that was a bit different, and that. Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people have commented on, that they appreciate. Like, I don't know how many of you have actually managed to read the book. I know it's still a pretty dense piece of writing. It's like somebody really wants to have to continue. But I like like, for example, Tom Attlee, who I admire greatly, he took about 1.5 years to read the book, but he never really put it away completely. And then because he actually got stuck on the questions and went down rabbit holes and did further research and did exactly what I wanted people to do, to not necessarily read the book in a one. I also remember somebody saying, I have it on my night table and I use it like a tarot set. Or other people say, when I get stuck in my work, I just randomly open a page and read it, and it normally gives me an idea. And yeah, that's another way of reading the book. I don't know if that was an answer. I hope that, yeah, okay. Anybody else who hasn't said anything? Trying to encourage inclusion here. No?
I wanted to ask, because I find it really interesting, like your life and your activity within the eco villages and Mallorca. I think I read in the book that you live in there. And I was more so like wanted to know about this activity, because you were also mentioning that like the change is going to happen from local to global, and I pretty much think that that's what we're doing right now, like within our project for the Bing course, trying to implement something in there to see how it goes, and yeah, create for this place and then spreading it. And yeah, I just wanted to ask about your activity in there.
Thank you. I mean, there's a sort of journey in. I said that before I went to Schumacher, I spent this time in southern Spain trying to set up an environmental education center and eco-village. And it was in an area called the Alpujarra, which is just south of the Sierra Nevada in Andalusia. And it's quite a rural, beautiful valley with a few villages and kind of a hippie's dream. And back then, my focus was very much on this kind of Schumacher, small is beautiful. How do I create my little eco-village where everything fits back into place and where we live in harmony with nature and in ways that actually positively influence the wider community. And then I also spending time at Findhorn, where I already tried to break down this bubble of people living in just their eco-village story and not really seeing the connection to the wider region and the villages, the normal villages nearby. And that in the whole eco-village movement, there has been this pattern that when people start setting up these intentional communities, it's the hard work of setting up a whole infrastructure in a community that makes them focus on that project to a point that they then create this slightly bubble effect where they're not enough connected to the wider next whole, the bioregion that they're sitting in, the neighboring communities. And not necessarily by intention, just by sheer focus on the work at hand. And then it takes a long time to build trust again with the neighboring communities, because they see them as this kind of insular project that doesn't reach out. And then Rob Hopkins' wonderful impulse kind of spread around the world with transition towns, and I helped to bring some transition town work to Germany and also to a couple of places in the UK. And again, I saw people focused on the community scale, and even helped to set up the first Masters in Sustainable Community Design while I was at Findhorn with Harriet Watt University. But it's around that time that I realized that the bioregional scale is actually the scale where you can create whole systems change and a repatterning of how humans fit into landscape and fit into an ecosystem and meet their needs more local, more regionally than globally, where it's not about creating a lifeboat and cutting off from the world. There will still be trade, there will still be global connection and global collaboration, but where in a more and more brittle and volatile global situation, it actually makes sense to try to at least have food, water, energy sovereignty come home to place again. And in that process, nourish a parallel economy to the global economy, which is focused to supply the bioregion, which creates more jobs, more diverse jobs, more meaningful jobs. It creates the opportunity for people to maybe work for some money in the big global economy, but only part-time, and then work for less money, but a lot more meaning and a lot of other capitals than financial capital by serving their region. And so for me, when I realized that my learning was now bioregional, was around the time that I was also ready to leave the far north of Scotland and the weather patterns and the lack of light and come back to the Mediterranean. And I chose Mallorca because it's an island, and because islands are very well-defined bioregions. You don't have an argument about where the bioregion ends when you're on an island. And my work here since has been, like, initially I was very focused on only wanting to take jobs here, and I set up a consultancy and I worked with the local tourism innovation cluster and a local shoe company that is international, and a number of other local businesses. And I also gave a lot of, like, created a eco-village design education course here that sort of seeded a grassroots network that a lot of wonderful projects have come out at that time. And also sometimes brought companies here, persuading them to use Mallorca as a study, a field, like an experiment site. So for example, I did this work with Ecover, the Belgian eco-detergent company, where we looked into, could we use biological forestry and organic municipal waste streams and fermentation and biodigestion technologies to, out of these waste streams, create the chemicals that we then would make soaps and floor cleaners and detergents out of, that we could sell to the tourism industry here on Mallorca. So really experimenting systemically at the bioregion scale around the biomaterials closed loop economy. And since I wrote my book, because it's hard in this setting. Mallorca is very tourism focused, and at the time I felt a little bit like Don Quixote, trying to convince people that the good days of tourism were numbered, and that their big opportunity would be to use the big income from tourism to actually risk manage their portfolios and begin to invest in local organic agriculture, invest in local water treatment and water, like healing the water cycle, invest in local renewable energy and a more distributed e-transport network that isn't dependent on private cars, and all those, like they were raking in the money, so they had the potential to reinvest big time then. Unfortunately, now with COVID, that industry is of course really heavily hit, and I'm now seeing that, like, after my book came out, I spent a lot of time talking about bioregional regeneration and thinking about it and building courses on it. But what I haven't done in the last 4 years enough is to actually do the work here on Mallorca. I'm personally at a place right now where I want to come back to really ground my work, because I have a little daughter now, and her life will bring me into relationship with community in a new way again, and also because the island is suffering now, and so I've been helping a friend to create a proposal to really look at Mallorca as a regional ecosystems restoration example that could inform how ecosystems restoration can be done across the Mediterranean and in Mediterranean climate zones, and use the potential that we have being an island of being one of the first bigger landscape scale ecosystems restoration projects that not only look at the land, but also look at the connection between the sea and the land, because we're islands. So to in parallel have marine restoration and regeneration projects and terrestrial ones. And on the one hand, I sometimes feel hard on myself of not having done a lot in the last 3 or 4 years here on Mallorca, but I do always seed with giving talks or having an open ear to local players and advising them on, and so for me, but when you work at the bioregional scale, it becomes such a complex multi-stakeholder cross-sector process that you can just forget about controlling it and doing it the kind of hard way. It's like dancing with a system. It's seeding worldviews. It's the most powerful thing that you can do for that kind of change is to seed ideas in people's minds and then be really happy when 2 years later they come to you super excited and tell you the idea that you told them 2 years ago, but believe that they've just had this idea, because then you've really got them. Like the way you have to work on your own ego to not want to say I told you so, because that spoils it. But there's nothing more powerful than meme seeding ideas in people's minds and them then taking it on and going on a mission. But of course you can't control exactly what they're going to do with it. So it's a dancing with systems.
That's a very oh Jesus, sorry. That's a very beautiful answer and a really nice bridge to one of the 2 last questions that I'd prepared, because we're running into the last 10 minutes. And you see that the deep seeding of seeds of change in a way in other people is one of the key aspects that you can do to act in a regenerative way. I think there's a strong relationship there with your comments about pages and the importance of language and the importance of storytelling. Would you, or what would be your advice in a way for these students now who are becoming these types of storytellers, who are trying to become the planters of these seeds? What would be your advice from terms of storytelling and language and pages to help them to hopefully plant some seeds of change, and maybe in 2 or 3 years have that ego swallowing moment? And then the small side comment is that I also used to live in Scotland, so I can relate to your weather patterns comment there.
I mean, briefly, I mentioned the PhD earlier. Like when I wrote my PhD, I thought it was going to be called Design for Sustainability. That's why I still have the Gmail address, Design for Sustainability. But in the end, I didn't really feel that the word sustainability was giving a message on the pattern that would be needed in order to create that. And it also didn't really say, what are we trying to sustain? And that's why back then I called my PhD Design for Human and Planetary Health. And I started to meme seed this idea of nested, like that health is an emergent property at different levels of complexity, from cellular health to organ health to individual health to family health to community health to bioregional health or ecosystems health to planetary health. And that when we design, when we plan any kind of intervention, if we ask ourselves the question, how do we contribute to that scale linking pattern of health with our intervention, but also understanding health dynamically as an evolutionary developmental process, not in this kind of resilience that is all about bouncing back to a rigid state, but in this transformative resilience of being able to anticipate changes in the environment and transform the system so you can meet what you know is coming in a way that you're actually in a better position to weather those storms. And I think every community is now, with climate change and what's going on the planet, called to do that. And so for me, the powerful patterns of interrelationships, of connecting not just how does the place where you do your project or the city you're doing your course in, where you live, sit in the wider bioregion and in the continental context, but also the Netherlands have a very deep historic connection to every place around the planet because of the colonial past and the trader past. And how do you use that potential of deep connection in a healing way that addresses the wrongdoings of some of that history, that heals the traumas that we have put under the carpet, but at the same way also doesn't go into a sort of self-incriminating, oh, we're all so bad, but into a kind of celebrating the wonderful global connections that the Netherlands has always had. And I see a lot of wonderful stuff coming out of the Netherlands at the moment. I'm on the advisory council of the Common Land Foundation, and the amazing work that Willem Verweerde has done with this 4 returns strategy. Also very great way of communicating bioregional change, and ecosystems protection in a holistic way. And also I'm also on the advisory council of the Ecosystems Restoration Camp Foundation, and we're at the beginning of the UN decade of ecosystems restoration. And I think that's a space where all of you have huge potential to find the way that you can express your unique contribution to all this. And I mean, I'm really curious about the graphic stuff that you just mentioned earlier, Bas, because for me that's a powerful thing. If you have the ability to take complex ideas into graphic communication, one image can I mean, look at what donut economics. It's one image, yeah? But it unfolds, it unpacks such a powerful conversation, and particularly when you focus it on place, the work that Kate is now doing in Amsterdam and with cities. Helping to create those kind of images is also a powerful path. But really, it's each and every one of you has to discover your own path in this, because you all have something unique to offer in this, and otherwise we wouldn't be here right now.
Well, thank you very much. We'll be sure to share some of the images, or all of the images to see, but once they've all been updated and such, we will be very happy to explore some of the visualizations. And the idea behind it was more arts-based learning in a way, to be able to relate stronger to the materials by trying to visualize that complexity. One thing that really triggered me, what you just said, was about that evolutionary capacity. So learning to think about the implications of your interventions across different system levels, as well as different time skills, and the now, the future, the past. It's really interesting, and look very much forward to seeing how that develops with the students over the next 10, 15 weeks. I would
briefly to that, there's a powerful mental shift when you understand that. I think that part of how we come up with solutions and how we think about how do we respond to climate change, biodiversity loss, all the problems in the world, rather than looking at potential, is that we end up creating these sequenced strategies within our linear time thinking. And there's a huge potential to understand that really change always only happens in the now, in what you're doing right now, right in this moment. You'll never be able to do anything in any other moment than being in the present. And so to become more aware of how you're being and how your way of working is actually repatterning the future in the present. One of my mentors, Tony Hodgson from H3 Uni, which is, by the way, h3uni.org, is full of wonderful resources of how to think systemically and so on. There's I'll send you the link to share. He has this wonderful phrase called the future potential of the present moment. Because it brings us all like a kind of loop to where we started the conversation. That everything we do and everything we say and how we say it, how we are in our team, how we are in relationship to how you do the project in that area of Den Haag and how you interact with everybody else is actually repatterning the future. You can, in the very way that you approach your project in this developmental evolutionary way that is place sourced, that looks for essence, that focuses on the potential rather than the problems. All of that as small ways of repatterning an approach that everybody you will get in contact with will be influenced by. And that's how we actually change the world.
Well, that's very beautiful. I don't want to add anything to detract from the beauty of that last minute. So I would like to ask everyone to join me in thanking you very much for this very inspiring 1.5 hours.
Great. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Good. I will. We'll be in touch through email as well, and I suppose how to deal with the recordings and such. But it's been really a great honor. I do have one very cheeky last question, and that's if you would like to stay up to date about the work that the students are doing, and to see some of the results of their regenerative processes and discovery.
I would absolutely love to see them. I won't be able to necessarily comment on all of them because
of course.
I'm currently focused on trying to find a piece of land to regenerate here on Mallorca and move my family. But yeah, please do stay in touch, and I would love to see what you're doing, and who knows, like maybe next year we can reconnect somehow. I don't know how long the course runs.
It's a full semester.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, sounds like a wonderful course, and just enjoy there's a Buddhist practice of counting your blessings. And as a student, no matter how stressed you are with the student work and, oh God, I've got to do this now, count your blessings that you have the privilege of education, because it is a privilege, and there are lots of people around the world who would love to do the course you're doing and can't. So if you connect to that privilege, it makes the other jumping through academic hoops much easier. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.